Let's keep it moving in our agenda. We just finished our recap of our drinks challenge, where we were using an API, but we haven't really talked about them much. So I'd like to draw your attention to my notes about APIs, where you could read more. And I'll just launch into some slides very briefly. Okay. So really, when we're working with APIs, it's just like making a request to some server somewhere that has been set up to like give us some data that we care about. So there are dozens, if not hundreds of APIs that would be really fun to get into and get data from for various reasons to make various kinds of apps. But why might it be in the interest of these API providers to give us programmatic access to their data? That's the question I'd like for us to think about. Basically, here's just a list of example APIs. All these services, many services that you use on a daily basis, whether they be social networks or other sites or platforms that you visit. We know that we could like manually visit those sites, like manually visit the New York Times. Click around, see some articles, view the articles. Okay, we could use the New York Times website manually. We could visit it, read the articles. But I guess also the New York Times is providing their own API, their own programmatic interface into their articles. Why would they even want to do that? It has to be in their interest somehow. What do you think? I guess like New York Times, if we want like the top stories, we can make a request to this kind of URL or whatever. We can read more about the New York Times specific endpoints on their docs. But like, why would the New York Times even want to give us programmatic access to their data? Thoughts? Like strategically. Yeah.
It's like how people create programs to get the most out of the data.
Yeah. What this enables is a third-party ecosystem of apps that like build on top of the New York Times. So maybe like we want to do some cool fun thing with certain articles and share articles with users. And maybe we're programmatically like requesting data from New York Times, and ultimately our users would be driven back to the New York Times. So if they're getting revenue from like ad impressions on people reading these articles, then by them giving us API access, we get to build like, we get to create this ecosystem of tools on top of this platform. And what generally happens is like this increases the overall usage of the underlying platform itself. So like when we listen to music online, we might have an option of services to use, Pandora or Spotify. I know there's like Apple Music too, but let's just confine our discussion to like Pandora versus Spotify. We could log into either service and listen to music on either service. So why would we choose one service over another? Spotify gives us a really awesome API or programmatic interface into their data. You can get your playlists, you can ask for related songs, all in a programmatic way, build apps to build on top of that Spotify service. Whereas Pandora doesn't have a public API. So I think that that really limits the usage of Pandora and provides Spotify with a competitive advantage. And so I would say just on the basis of whether or not a service offers an API, I think the ones that do offer APIs are much better positioned to succeed into the future. And so that's why it might be in the business's best interest to give us programmatic access to their data. Why is it helpful for us to get programmatic access to one of these sites? we just talked about it from the other end. Why would New York Times want to give us their data programmatically? What does this programmatic access to their data help us do, or what benefits do we have as the requester of this data? Yeah, programmatic access could leverage the benefits of automation and really help us do something that we would otherwise do manually very quickly, and remove the opportunity for like manual user error when we're like performing this process. So, all right, cool. We talked about APIs, why these businesses are giving us programmatic access to their data, and what it helps us do. Basically build an app on top of this great foundation. Okay, cool. So I really encourage you to explore the internet for different sites that you use. Like if you use a site, do a Google search, like see if that site has an API, and see if you could interface with that site that you use in a programmatic way. And that might be a really great thing to do for your final project. Okay, anyway, we saw what it looks like for us to like work with an API when we were dealing with the drinks API. What this process looks like practically is the API, or this source of data, needs to tell us, well, how could we request that data? What are the URLs that we could use? And when we request data from each specific URL that they provide, what data should we expect back? What's the format going to be in? Each one of these URLs is called an endpoint. So if you hear me use the word endpoint, it just means like, okay, in the drinks API, we had a non-alcoholic related URL. That would be like one endpoint. In the drinks API, we had like a way to search drinks via ingredient. That's a different endpoint into the same API. So we'll have to read the docs and learn what it's like to request data. What are the endpoints? How can we customize options in any given endpoint by providing different URL parameters to customize our request? When we start dealing with the AlphaVantage API in a few minutes, we'll see that there are a number of URL parameters in some example requests that we'll make. So this URL here that you see on the screen, I also copied it into our agenda in Slack so you could see it. But you'll see that in here, we're using many URL parameters. So after the question mark comes all of the URL parameters that allow us to customize the type of data that we get back. So like, what type of data do we want? Stock market data daily. Okay, great. Ampersand. What symbol do we want? Microsoft. Ampersand. Okay, what size do we want? Compact. Ampersand. Okay, what's our secret credential API key? Either some kind of demo key or our own secret credential. So when we're dealing with URL parameters, there's a few parts of what's going on. We see, like I talked about earlier, there's like this question mark in a URL. If you see a question mark, it says there are some URL parameters to follow. Everything else in this URL will be some set of key value pairs. Parameter name, parameter value. So in this URL here, parameter name of function, I guess value is time series daily. Each set of URL parameters is separated by an ampersand, and that allows us to continue to customize this request. Ampersand, oh, okay, another set of parameters. Symbol is the parameter name, equals MSFT, I guess is the parameter value. And there's other URL parameters here. And so we can customize the request by supplying certain URL parameters if they are supported by the API. So I think that's a good segue into us actually using the AlphaVantage API. Let's do it. I'd like to draw your attention now into the AlphaVantage API docs. I'm introducing this new API to you.
It's called AlphaVantage. It just gives us some financial market data. All right. In order to use this API, you'll need a secret credential called an API key. And we'll talk about security in a sec. You can sign up for your own API key, or I've provided you a number of API keys that you could use. So if you click on this link in our agenda today, you will see a number of different secret passwords. So that I'm partnering with the AlphaVantage API, and they've provided me with these premium credentials to use their service. And so you can use these credentials as well. And so they'll allow us to use their service in the fullest way. Some of these endpoints that we see on the left, we could just use a normal credential, but some of them you'll see say like premium. So if we want to use these, we'll need a premium credential. And so you'll see that when we look at the documentation for any one of these endpoints, any one of these URLs, what we'll generally see is that each endpoint may have its own parameters. So if we want stock market data on a daily basis, we might be able to customize like the symbol parameter to specify which company we want to learn about. And maybe there's other parameters we can customize as well. Like in this case, output size. Like, do we want just 100 days or 20 years worth of data? Okay, so there's some ability for us to customize how much data we're asking for. Cool. Some other parameters in this daily data endpoint, if we just keep looking through them, data type, I guess by default, we'll get JSON data. And we know how to work with JSON data. We practiced that a few minutes ago. Alternatively, I guess if we wanted the data in CSV format, maybe we could change up our URL and say, include this parameter of like data type equals CSV. And now that will give us CSV formatted data. So anyway, this particular API is giving us different ways of customizing our request with these different URL parameters. And the most important parameter here that we see is the API key. This is like a secret credential that we supply along with our request to tell the service who's making the request. So in order to use this service, you could either sign up for your own API key or just use one of the keys that I'm providing you. And we'll talk about like why this security aspect is important in a few minutes, but let's just see if we could like get this data first. I guess for this daily stock market data, finally, we see some of the example URLs. And so when we were looking at the drinks API, we were looking at the docs to find these URLs, like which URL do we use to request some data? And so we see that here as well in this financial data API. So when we try to make that example request in the browser using a URL like this, now we're starting this process. Okay, there's some data here. What does it look like? Example request URL. All right. So, whoa. Could someone help us just kind of make sense of what we see here in terms of the structure of this data? First of all, what format is it in? JSON or CSV or HTML? Thoughts? Format of this data? Does it look like JSON or CSV? Thoughts? Yeah, JSON. It looks like lists and dictionaries and stuff like that. JSON. Okay, cool. Whoa, it looks super nested though. Any other thoughts about what this data looks like? How can we make sense of it? Yeah, whoa, look at how nested all these dictionaries are. There's one dictionary. I guess it has two top level keys. One is metadata, the other is like time series daily. Okay, once we get into that, now instead of a nice list, we actually have more dictionaries. And so we have like this time series, I guess, is like a dictionary of dictionaries. Whoa, kind of a pain to work with. But we would just observe the structure and work with it. And so that's great. So I guess this data is about IBM. What happens if we wanted Google stock prices? What would we do? Thoughts? We have some IBM data here, but what if we wanted the stock prices for like a different stock, like Microsoft or Google? Thoughts? Yeah, in the docs, we saw there were a number of ways to customize our request, and one of those URL parameters was symbol. So I guess we say like symbol equals and then like the stock ticker. So I guess in our first URL, we were saying symbol equals IBM, but if we change that to like GOOGL, now, oops, we would see Google data, so you got it right. But this is important too. What's happening here? We tried to make another request, but it's like, it's telling us, it's not giving us Google data, it's telling us something else. Thoughts about what we're seeing here? Yeah. Yeah. So I guess this API is saying, hey, sure, if you want to make a request, that's fine. You could use our demo API key. And here you'll see the URL that they gave us on the end has API key equals demo. But they're saying, hey, if you want to keep using this service, you actually need to get your own secret credential and supply it along with your requests. So why is it important for AlphaVantage to know who's requesting this data? Or I guess the Twitter API or the New York Times API. Why is it important for them, the platform, the API, to know who's requesting the data? They want us to supply an API key to tell them who we are when we're requesting this data. Why? Do they care? What would be some bad things that could happen if they don't ask who's requesting some data? Maybe we could focus on like Twitter. We want to fetch some data from Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. Why would it be important for us to say who we are when we're trying to fetch data from Instagram? Obviously, yeah, there might be some malicious ways that us just making a request could actually end up kind of like being almost a hacking technique. There's two answers to this question. One is like a denial of service and malicious action. And the other is about access control and data privacy. So we can make programmatic requests to an API and it helps us leverage the benefits of automation. We can make hundreds of thousands of requests in like a minute. But sometimes if we make too many requests to a given website in a too short of a period of time, that will overload the server and the server will just crash and it will bring down the whole site. And that's called a denial of service attack. And hackers actually use that technique to overwhelm and overload a server. So here we're making a request to some server provided by the API. If we make too many requests in too short of a time period, it might just crash the whole server. So one thing that an API key helps the API do is limit the number of requests each person makes in a given time period. So you may hear of rate limits. If you try to make too many requests in too short of a period of time, then an API might tell you, hey, just wait a minute and try again. And so they implement what's called a rate limiting strategy to help prevent those denial of service attacks, to help prevent their server from being overloaded. That's another reason why some APIs say, okay, you have 100 requests per day or 1,000 requests per day. So they're kind of like limiting the number of requests you can make in a given period of time. That's the security aspect of why API keys are important and these secret credentials are important. But if we focus on something more practical, like let's say we are making a request to Instagram for our posts. Why would it be important to tell Instagram who's making that request? Thoughts? What if our account's private? If we have a private Instagram account, only our followers could see our posts.
And so normal people can't see our posts manually if they use the Instagram platform. Like if you search for a user and their profile is private, you just can't see those posts, and that's as desired. So why would we programmatically be able to use the platform in a way that we can or shouldn't be able to use it manually? Why would we be able to make a programmatic request for someone's private posts if we're not that person? So when we supply a secret credential, our API key, along with our request to an API, we're saying who we are, and now the platform can understand if we have access to the data that we're supposed to be requested. So hopefully that makes sense. By us saying who we are, it also helps the platform determine whether or not we should have access to the data we're requesting. So there may be some access controls. Okay, all right. So let's get back into the hands-on part of this. We talked about APIs. We saw some example endpoint and its documentation and ways to customize it. We started making requests, and now we hit this detour related to API keys. So we talked about them and why they're important, but now we can, I guess, use one of the example keys. So I'm providing you with these example keys. You could just choose one of them at random, just so everyone isn't using the same one. And now we could supply this credential as our secret API key to tell the API who is making this request. So I'm just going to change up this URL and say, instead of API key equals demo, API key equals, whatever credential they provided me. And now since we're asking for Google data, if you remember, hopefully we'll get that Google data. Great. Now we actually got the Google data we want. We had to customize this request a little bit. So I just want to pause, see if there's any questions conceptually about what APIs are about, how we would use them.